Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. In 2016, the journalist Pavel Sheremet was killed in a car bomb in Kiev, one of several journalists murdered in the country for their investigative work in recent years. In 2019, 5 people were brought to trial for his murder, including a rock singer, a doctor, and a nurse. It's an intriguing and tragic story which sheds light upon what is happening in Ukraine today. And I'm delighted to have our regular expert on the region, Leonid Ragozin, with us here to discuss it. Hello, Leonid.
Hello, good to see you all.
Where are you at the moment, Leonid?
I'm in Riga at my permanent base.
Okay, it looks very stark there in your room.
It is very dark outside. It's just for the contrast.
Okay. Well, in a moment, we're going to look at Pavel Sheremet, who he was, and take a look at the official investigation into his death. But before we do that, I just want to bring people up to date a little on Ukraine, a quick and very basic recap. After President Yanukovych was ousted, there was the Maidan Revolution. The Russians launched a war on Donbass, and I think most people know that there's been a tenuous ceasefire that has been holding in the Donbass region, so that the conflict with Russia has effectively been on hold for several years. I think people will also be slightly familiar with the comedian that then became president, that's Zelensky, who came into office in April 2019 when he defeated President Poroshenko. Just tell us a bit about him, Leonid. What was he promising to do? How did he win that election?
President Zelensky is a very remarkable case. First of all, because he came to presidency by playing president in a comedy series. And that was a comedy series about a common man, a history teacher, accidentally being elected the president of Ukraine, and everything that followed, everything that ensued, and how he dealt with the oligarchs, the mafia, with everything that Ukrainians is dealing in real time. So basically, this was his only agenda. This is how he got himself elected. And I don't think he himself expected to be elected, very much like Donald Trump in America. He decided to run, and then suddenly he was high up in the polls. And just because Ukrainians, they were so tired with the existing political establishment, including the establishment that came to power after Maidan, that they simply voted for this guy who represented themselves as they saw it, a common person.
He certainly captured people's imagination, and what a change we've seen this year. So in the last few weeks, I think people will be aware, or may be aware, that he's been in a battle with the Constitutional Court, which has tried to strike down his anti-corruption measures. There are measures that require people to list what assets they have, including the Constitutional Court judges themselves, many of which don't want to see their assets listed. So he's certainly in the thick of things now. And I know we're going to come back to that in a moment later on in the program. But before we do that, let's take a closer look at Sheremet himself. We've got a video here, which is from Radio Free Europe. It's about 7 minutes, so it's a bit longer than we normally play, but I think it's a really useful introduction to who Pavel Sheremet was, his death, and the state's failure to basically prosecute the people who were responsible for his murder. Here we go.
It's the morning show on Radio Vesti in Kiev, Ukraine.
Утро Павла Шеремета.
But the presenter hasn't arrived yet.
Ранок поки що розпочинається без Павла Шеремета. Він десь до нас у дорозі вже летить, щоб зустріти цей день разом із вами.
Pavel Sheremet never made it. Just a few meters from his house, a bomb exploded in his car.
Мы прерываемся на 3 минуты.
Срочное сообщение. В среду утром в результате взрыва машины погиб журналист Павел Шеремет. По информации издания «Украинская правда», машина взорвалась на...
An ambulance was quickly on the scene, but Sheremet never had a chance. Police investigators say CCTV video showed a woman putting something under the car the night before, and that she had an accomplice. But 1 year on, police still have not identified the suspects. This is an extract from a film made by Ukrainian investigative journalists. They examined hours of CCTV footage and have grave doubts about the official investigation.
Это либо полный провал профессионализма и некомпетентность, что печально. Либо другой вариант ответа, он еще печальнее. Это возможное нежелание и какие-то политические препятствия, возможное давление, которое оказывается на национальную полицию с тем, чтобы она не расследовала это дело. Это политическое убийство с определенной целью устранить значимого, известного и авторитетного журналиста.
Поехали.
Sheremet was considered one of the most distinguished journalists of his generation. His career spanned newspapers, radio, TV and documentary work in 3 former Soviet republics.
Я родился и вырос в городе Минске, и по образованию я банкир. Совершенно случайно стал журналистом. Уже 25 лет я занимаюсь журналистикой и ни одного дня не пожалел об этом.
Он был бы очень хорошим банкиром, это правда. Но он мне сказал: мама, да не люблю я это считать деньги, ну не люблю я, мне нужна свобода.
Sheremet's first job as a TV reporter was in the Minsk bureau of Russia's state-run television channel ORT in the mid-1990s. It was a turbulent time. Belarusian police were violently suppressing protests by opponents of President Alexander Lukashenko. Sheremet's reporting soon landed him at the centre of an international scandal.
Эти кадры, когда Павел перешел границу демонстративно в эфире, для того, чтобы показать, что белорусско-литовская граница дырявая, знаете, вот эти кадры, я помню, они просто у всех, кто смотрел, особенно у коллег, вызвали просто вот ощущение мурашек по телу, потому что стало ясно, что-то за этим последует. То есть, знаете, это как прыгнуть в бездну в эфире перед камерой.
After the report, Sheremet and his cameraman were arrested for illegally crossing the border. In response, Russia refused to allow President Lukashenko to fly across its airspace. Russian President Boris Yeltsin gave an ultimatum to Lukashenko. Soon afterwards, both men were given suspended sentences and released. In the late 90s, Sheremet moved to Moscow and became an anchor of a weekly political analysis show on Channel 1.
Вот на ваш взгляд, готов ли сам Путин?
He quit after about a year and later told young journalists that this period was a stain on his reputation.
Я же хочу дружить с президентами. Я же хочу быть вот тоже рядом. Медаль мне дадут какую-нибудь. Но совесть медалью-то ты не заменишь.
Ситуация была именно такой. Или ты остаешься на Первом канале и не позволяешь себе резких заявлений в адрес политики руководства страны, или же ты уходишь и ты свободен. Ситуация, после которой Паша уже ушел, была связана именно с его высказыванием именно по поводу Михаила Ходорковского, где он достаточно резко отозвался о президенте Путине.
In 2014, Sheremet moved again to Kiev. Here too, he was critical of the authorities and unafraid to ask hard questions, even of Ukraine's president.
Слухи про Бойко и про Ахметова, губернатор один, другой, это все насильница или Кремль настаивает?
Слушай, нет, Кремль, я думаю, что Кремль против. Я думаю.
Sheremet had a range of jobs in Kiev. At one point, he anchored a show on the independent channel TVI.
Спасибо большое. У нас в эфире был лидер российской оппозиции Борис Немцов, который уносит из нашей студии наши прекрасные часы с супермеханизмом.
Господи, сколько же осталось ему минут жить-то?
Nemtsov's time was also running out. In February 2015, he was shot in the back, just meters from the Kremlin. The following year, Pavel Sheremet was killed in Kiev. Ukrainian police have not even said how many suspects there are or what the motive may have been.
Для президента дело Паши закончилось днем похорон. Как человек он сделал то, что мог. Пришел на похороны.
Как президент он не сделал то, что он должен был сделать. Он не отслеживал это следствие в дальнейшем.
A report by the Committee to Protect Journalists says that Ukrainian security agencies have blamed one another for destroying crucial video evidence. It was written by RFERL correspondent Christopher Miller.
Dozens of people, including Pavel's family, friends, and journalist colleagues with whom I spoke for this report, blamed authorities' incompetence, negligence, or sabotage, or a combination of all three.
Over the course of his career, Sheremet's reporting antagonized many powerful people. A year after his killing, there are many theories about who might have wanted him dead, but few good answers.
Well, the reason why I thought it was important to play that video, it shows you how renowned he was in the region. This wasn't somebody who was, working for a small regional paper. This was somebody who had big regional significance, was known in Belarusia, was known in Russia, and certainly known very well in Ukraine. Leonid, can you just say what happened on, there was the reference there to the investigators losing evidence, failing to find evidence and evidence disappearing. Can you talk about what happened on the day of the murder as well?
Right. So on the day of the murder, there's actual video from his from the studio, from the radio studio where he worked, and that was shot on the day of the murder. He was going there. He woke up in the morning in the center of Kiev, very close to Maidan Square, where the revolution happened 2 years before. He entered his wife's car. Drove out, and he barely drove 200 meters when his car exploded, and that was it. He was almost instantly dead. And then once the breaking news were announced, Ukrainian officials started making statements. And most of the statements, especially from the nationalist part of the Ukrainian establishment, were to the effect that it is Russia. Putin must be behind it, because he was an opposition journalist. He was an opposition journalist in Belarus. He eventually became an opposition journalist in Russia, and that's why he moved to Ukraine. And then Russia is an aggressor, and it is waging a war against Ukraine. So yeah. Easy, that's Russia. So all of these statements were about it. And then, of course, one would expect that the Ukrainian authorities would find those Russian perpetrators and link this crime to the Russian secret services and so on, and they would do it quite promptly, because that's what Ukraine needs, and that's what probably was.
Let's just bring up, because what happened was that nothing happened for 3 years in terms of any prosecutions. Nobody was actually
exactly. What happened is that nothing happened. Nothing at all was happening for the next 3 years. For the next 3 years, until President Poroshenko lost elections to President Zelensky in 2019, and then what happened? 2 months later, 2 months after Zelensky was elected, Zelensky summoned the chief of the police and asked him formally what is happening with this investigation. And after this conversation, they both went out to the press, and they said that the investigation was artificially stalled by the previous political leadership. The policemen and the investigators were prevented from doing all their work, but now with the new president, they will start working on the case.
Let's bring up a website here now, because when the prosecutions are brought forward, it's very surprising. So again, this is RFL, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe's website here, which has got a good background article on it. There are 5 suspects here, and maybe you can just run through them. This is the first one, and I referenced this chap in my discussions. All of them are linked to the Donbass, the sort of Ukrainian defense in the Donbass, and they've got very odd profiles. This guy's a rock singer. Tell us a bit more about them, Leonid.
Okay, so that happened about 3 months after Zelensky met with the police chief and made those announcements. The police in November 2019, they made arrests and they announced the names of the suspects. There were initially 5 names of suspects and witnesses who were about to become suspects. But somehow this 2 witnesses dropped off in the following months. So now we are down to 3 main suspects. And this first person is Andrei Antonenko. He is a rock singer who became a bit of a mascot for Ukrainian special operations services. So he goes to the front line and he sings for the soldiers, and he formerly is a member of the elite special forces of Ukraine.
Let's roll up the page a bit and we come on to the another suspect. And this is the doctor I was referring to, Yulia Kuzmenko, again linked to the defense forces in the Donbass area, the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, exactly. Yulia Kuzmenko is one of many people in Ukraine who volunteered to help the army after Russia invaded and started attacking Ukraine. Yulia Kuzmenko is a professional doctor, but essentially for the last 5 years now, she worked on the front line, helping soldiers and saving soldiers' life. She's a surgeon. She's a children's surgeon originally, but she was treating soldiers for the last 5 years, and she was organizing, collecting money for the soldiers and for the medical.
Let me go on to the next one, which is a nurse. So again, this is a nurse with one of the battalions in the Donbass area. It's a very strange array of people, and they really don't, I mean, it doesn't sort of, as a conspiracy goes, that they seem an odd group to sort of produce for a trial.
Yeah, the main thing about all these 3 people is that they are exemplary Ukrainian patriots. These are the kind of people who are revered as heroes in Ukraine, as people who rose up when Russia invaded. They went to the front line and they were helping the Ukrainian army, and they were risking their lives.
And what's their alleged motive, Leonid? And why do they want to get rid of this leading journalist?
Well, according to investigation, their motive was to destabilize the situation in the country with the goal of radicalizing the army, the country's leadership, and thus reactivating the war in Donbass and sort of forcing the Ukrainian army to advance and fight the Russians earnestly.
I want to stand back a bit now and just talk about the actual reform process that Ukraine is still trying to tackle. But looking over this case, you've got oligarchs who own radio stations. You've got one who's fled with Yanukovych. You've got a powerful state security who is still involved in things. You've got cases apparently being constructed for the courts. None of it sounds particularly positive. Can you talk about what progress Zelensky has had? He promised to change all of this. He promised to get rid of the power of the oligarchs, to remove the corruption within the economy and within the courts. Well, how do you assess how far he's got since he's been in office?
Well, look, Zelensky was elected on his main promise was to bring peace with Russia, and he has achieved some progress. There is less fighting, less people are being killed. The conflict is almost entirely frozen. So he did achieve that. He was also a very unifying figure because the previous leadership, President Poroshenko, he was throughout his term he was tilting towards nationalism, and in his campaign against Zelensky, he decided to run as a fully fledged Ukrainian nationalist. He was against the usage of Russian language in public space, in education, in a country where half of the people speak Russian as their first language. So Zelensky was against all that, but despite that, he couldn't change that legislation. And the third thing was corruption. Yes, he said that he will fight corruption. That's exactly what the revolution was about, and that's exactly what Poroshenko was promising during his term. But then, alas, it so happened that Poroshenko was also accused of corruption multiple times, including by the Western partners. There were cases like Vice President Biden coming to Kiev and insisting that Poroshenko sacks his prosecutor general because he was also accused of corruption. Corruption was the main sort of leitmotif.
Okay, so that's the actual election campaign. That's what happened to Poroshenko. But once Zelensky gets into office, the kind of people he appoints to his cabinet are not professional politicians or professional administrators. He deliberately chooses people who don't have any of that background at all. But that doesn't seem to last too long because within a year, he's fired them all.
Yeah, well, Zelensky is, it's an act of improvisation. It's an act of improvisation in theater terms. It's an act of political improvisation. He didn't have a team at all when he got elected. His team were fellow comedians and people from his company that was producing comedy. These are his trustees. This is the only person he trusts. Some of them had some political connections, and some of them had connections to oligarchs. And that affected, of course, the initial months and still affecting his governance style. Yeah. In short, it was all very random. This factor of randomness, it dominated everything he did.
Yeah,
and
I'm going to ask people to start putting questions in the Q&A box now, so we can open up the discussion. And if you've got any questions about any aspect of Ukraine, whether it's the conflict, whether it's relations with Russia, whether it's about Zelensky himself, whether it's about the impeachment hearings and how Ukraine managed to ride through that, please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll come to those. I want to bring things slightly up to date now on what's been happening over the past 6 months and talk about that conflict with the Constitutional Court. Both the European Union and the IMF have made loans or funds that have been released to Ukraine contingent upon anti-corruption measures. And part of that are a series of laws that basically show, make officials, public officials, declare what assets they have. And the Constitutional Court had been blocking that. What was Zelensky's response to that? Because it didn't seem very democratic to me.
Not at all. First of all, unlike in Russia, Zelensky does not control the Constitutional Court in Ukraine. And that's a good thing about Ukraine. The bad news is that this Constitutional Court was largely created, most of the judges were elected into the Constitutional Court under previous presidents, and most of them were elected even before Maidan. And they are indeed independent.
And how are they appointed? If you want to replace people or change the constitution of the court or the way we're appointed, I think there are 3 different bodies who do that.
Well, yes, it is the president. It is the president and the parliament, and it works in many ways in the same way as it does in America. That with each presidential term and with each parliamentary term, new judges are being added. But it's really not more than 2 or 3 new judges within each 4-year term. So the turnover is not very quick, and the court is still dominated by people who got elected back in the early noughties in 2003 and 2004. And they are independent from the current president, but they are probably not independent from vested interests, from oligarchic interests which dominate Ukrainian politics. And that's why the Constitutional Court, all of a sudden, this autumn, in October, it adopted this this ruling, which
striking down the legislation that Parliament had passed.
Yeah, which essentially based the publication of asset declaration, which all the Ukrainian officials are supposed to file and publicize. So that was one of the gains of Maidan revolution, that every official, from the president and down to the lowest level in some village, all of them, and all public sector workers as well, They were supposed to file asset declarations, and these are available on a website, and journalists in particular are using it.
So it's a key anti-corruption measure, which would really show you that officials are taking bribes or benefiting elsewhere. That kind of thing would expose that kind of activity. But I think it's the irony of this idealist coming in to tackle corruption, and in doing so, he wants to dismiss the Constitutional Court. And I know the Venice Commission, which basically assesses the standards of justice and constitutional affairs, throughout Europe, has been very critical of him in the process. So it's a tremendous tangle. But yet at the same time, they clearly want to implement those reforms because they won't be getting the money. I'd love to get more. We haven't had any questions so far, so I'd love to get some questions. Let's move sideways slightly, Leonid. What's been the fallout? What damage was there from the impeachment trial in the States, and how Ukraine was drawn into that?
Ukraine became a victim of internal strife in the United States during the presidency of Donald Trump, as everybody probably knows, that Trump was sending his emissary Rudy Giuliani to Ukraine to find dirt on now President-elect Biden, with the help of Ukrainian oligarchs, Giuliani managed to line up really a bunch of major politicians and especially prosecutors who were helping him to partly falsify, partly find this dirt, or partly falsify.
I guess the question is, what's been the long-term? Has there been long-term damage to the Ukraine standing, or is it just something that Trump's going, it doesn't matter in the end, and they can breathe a sigh of relief?
Well, I think Zelensky managed the situation quite brilliantly. Ukraine is existentially dependent on the United States, and Ukraine doesn't have a choice. It cannot stake on Trump or stake on Biden. It has to deal with any American president, any president the Americans vote for. So they had to deal with Trump despite his unpredictability. And it didn't help that Biden's son really was on the board of a company that belonged to, again, a minister who was accused of corruption, who was accused of money laundering, and who belonged to exactly to that old elite that was ousted by Maidan revolution. So America did create a lot of mess in Ukraine. Right. Okay. Well, we've got some questions coming in. Nigel Harley has got a good one. And I should say that Leonid has been covering Ukraine for a very long period of time. Used to work for the BBC. He writes for Bloomberg quite regularly. And he also writes the guides for The Lonely Planet. So he knows those churches and museums as well as the news. Nigel Harley, you've got a question. Go ahead, Nigel. You just need to open up your microphone. Bottom left hand. There we go.
Yeah. Now, my basic question is, I've always had the impression that Ukraine is a country of two parts, with the western part looking very much towards Poland and the West and the EU and that, whereas the East has tended more to look towards Russia and that, with Kiev probably leaning towards the West. Is that still the case? And also, what is the level of enthusiasm for membership of the EU? Because I was in Kiev a few years ago, and I remember at that time, particularly the young people seemed very interested in the prospect of EU membership.
God, there's a lot packed into that question, Leonid, but should we just break it down and just talk about enthusiasm for EU membership? Because then I think you can get into questions of religious identity and Ukrainian and Russian identity and which church you belong to. And all that. I think it is, to begin with, it is important to say that yes, Ukraine is divided into the predominantly Ukrainian-speaking western part and the predominantly Russian-speaking southeastern part.
And of course, the Russian speakers naturally they don't want to break up with Russia completely for the simple reason that they have relatives there in Russia. There was a poll before Maidan when people were asked whether they have relatives in Russia, and 28% of Ukrainians, of all Ukrainians, say they had close relatives in Russia. Close as in, sisters, brothers, parents. And that's, I don't know whether it compares to Britain and Ireland. It's probably more than that. It's a very high percentage. So it's we're talking about Siamese twins. It's really hard to break this down. But the policy, the nationalist policy in Ukraine of the nationalist dominated West, and also the West which supports the national tendencies in Ukraine, is to actually delineate it, to cut Ukraine from Russia. And the question is whether it's doable or whether it's just a dystopian project that alienates people, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine.
Well, Leonid, what do you mean by cut Ukraine from Russia? I don't understand what you mean by that.
Well, in simple terms, if Ukraine joins the European Union, the first thing that emerges, which emerged after the former communist countries entered the European Union, is a hard border. It basically means that those relatives, those brothers and sisters who lived on both sides of the border, they will need visas to travel one to another. That's the simplest complications. But on top of that, there's a lot of cross-border trade, there is a lot of economic relations, and so on and so forth. So that's why it is extremely painful. This geopolitical explanation, like saying that the Russian speakers, they are for Russia, and
every government in the last, even my brain's seizing up, pre-Maidan, every single government since independence has been trying to engage with the European Union and also NATO for some time, and gain close association. So you've got the association agreement that was signed in 2015. So ostensibly, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian electorate have supported membership of the EU.
Exactly. And for a long time, Russia was not exactly against the membership in Ukraine's membership in the European Union, because many in Russia still believe that once Ukraine is a part of the European Union, then maybe Russians also have a chance at some point later to join the European Union, because Russia is in many ways has a more advanced economy in Ukraine. It's a richer country than Ukraine, and institutionally, it's in some ways it is more developed than Ukraine, despite the lack of democracy at the moment. However, Putin in 2013, when Ukraine was about to sign an agreement with the European Union about its intent to join the European Union, Putin decided that it goes against the geopolitical interests of Russia, that it might potentially bring a threat to Russia, that it might invite NATO eventually into Ukraine. And NATO in Ukraine essentially means that NATO troops would be located 400 kilometers away from Moscow, from the main population centers in Russia. It does present a perceived threat. And many in Russia would consider, even liberals in Russia, especially now with President Trump having been elected in America, people can see that America can be unpredictable. If NATO troops are in Ukraine 400 kilometers away from Moscow, what happens if somebody worse than Trump get elected, So these are all the considerations.
Those are the fears, although one would make the obvious distinction between NATO and EU membership. Jim Lowenstein, you've got a question. Go ahead, Jim. Go on, Jim.
23 or 4 years ago, I had the experience of being chairman of a Ukraine fund for 4 years. There was a huge burst of enthusiasm for investment in Ukraine at that point. We found that it was extremely difficult to do business in Ukraine, principally because of the corruption in the judiciary. At any rate, we managed to sell off most of the assets to Russians, but it was not a happy experience. And I wondered after Zelensky's election whether there was another burst of foreign investment or whether that hasn't happened.
No burst of foreign investment has happened after Zelensky got elected. There is no breakthrough on that front. Risks still very high, and I'm not really I'm not a business journalist, and I will not be able to judge all the factors that investors are juggling. But I would have imagined that the lack of real institutional changes, particularly with the courts and particularly with security bodies, the police, the Ukrainian security services that remain unreformed, that remain very similar to what we have in Russia, a dictatorial state essentially. The lack of any progress on the rule of law side of things, I think it does frighten the investors. And Zelensky, for starters, he's only been a year in the office, and he's been under great pressure from vested interests, from oligarchs, oligarchs he's been allied with, and oligarchs who are acting against him. It was objectively hard for him to change anything. And I'm not sure he will manage in the next 3 years of his term.
That was the court system that was the real problem. I mean, we had an investment in a pasta factory, and the manager decided to just take over the factory. And we then discovered that the local provincial governor was a great friend of the head of the provincial court, and there was absolutely nothing we could do. So the German company that owned the equipment simply came in with its trucks one night and took the equipment out.
The governors and the oligarchs, so the two overlapping powers, or at least they were when we were traveling there a few years ago.
But it's actually very interesting that you bring up this regional aspect, because one of the successes of revolution was the decentralization in Ukraine. That's considered a success. More money, the regions, the provinces, they got more control over the money they are being taxed, they're generating. The budgets of Ukrainian regions were filled with more money, and the governors became much more independent than they used to be. But that happened in the absence of rule of law. And then you have exactly this situation which you, Jim, described, when the regional governor is a friend of the head of the regional court, and together they decided which investors can work in their region and which investors can't.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Sheila de Beleg first, and then Simon Jackson, because Simon Jackson's questions have helped to round things off a bit. Go ahead, Sheila.
Okay, Leonid, is Ukraine still the breadbasket of Russia? Does Russia need it more than vice versa?
Well, Ukraine has been. Russia is not dependent on Ukraine at all. Russia can live without Ukraine, except for one thing. The gas pipelines which supply gas into Europe, they run through Ukraine. And Ukraine theoretically can block those supplies, or it can impose costs on Russia that Russia does not agree with. This is why Russia is trying to bypass this gas pipe route by building another pipeline from Russia directly to Germany by the Baltic Sea, on the bed of the Baltic Sea. But the American government, Trump's administration, has been trying to prevent this from happening, to stall this project at the very last stage. I think they have 75 kilometers left of the pipes to be laid before this pipeline starts working. Ukraine was quite dependent on Russian gas because it produces some gas, but not nearly enough for its economy to function. Its it's dependent on the supplies of other raw materials from Russia, but there are alternatives around the world. And in addition to that, the coal reserves in Ukraine, which Ukraine has in abundance, they happen to be in the war zone, and most of the Ukrainian coal reserves are now being controlled effectively by Russia, by the pro-Russian separatists.
Yeah.
So that's the equation. The West is helping Ukraine by supplying cheap gas to compensate for the loss of the Russian gas, because Ukraine is trying not to be dependent on the Russian gas at all, because Russia is using gas as a means of economic dictate and political dictate. But yes, Ukraine without Russia, without normal economic relations with Russia, Ukraine is in a very precarious situation, and that's why it needs all the help from international organizations like International Monetary Fund and Western partners. This money they're getting from Western partners is the lifeline of this country.
But just to come back to that point that was raised earlier, Leonid, I mean, do you think the majority of the population still support integration with the European Union?
The majority of the population does support the integration. Relative majority of the population supports the integration with the European Union. The support of Ukraine entering NATO, I think it hovers around 50%. And yes, as Nigel has pointed out, there is a big regional discrepancy. And I just happened to look at the poll conducted in Mariupol, the largest of the cities in Donbass, in the region where the war is raging, the largest city, which happens to be on the Ukrainian side. It has the population of 500,000 people, and it's a seaside city and a major industrial center. So in this city, most of people say, we are Ukrainians, we are not Russians. Most of people say we are for Ukraine, but at the same time, I think 88% of people in this city want Russian language to become the second official language in Ukraine. 65 or 70% of these people say.
Where is this, Leonid? So which city are we talking about?
It's Mariupol. In the southeast Ukraine. It's basically a frontline city. The Donetsk People's Republic, the self-proclaimed state, starts on the outskirts of Mariupol.
The last big city before Crimea as well.
Well, there is a couple more, but it's further east. It's the last big city before Russia itself, on the coast. People, this poll shows essentially that when people are told to choose between Russia and the West, between Russia and Ukraine, between Russian and Ukrainian language, it's a kind of a false dilemma for them. They are not against the European Union. They are probably for the European Union, but they are against the hard border appearing on the border of Russia. They against being separated from Russia culturally and politically. So the problem is about reconciling this, trends that go in opposite directions.
Okay. We should say something briefly about Donbass before we come on to Simon Jackson's question. What is the current situation? The ceasefire is in place. There's sometimes bursts of fighting, but not much. It's fairly quiet. Is that right? And what's the long term? What is Russia demanding for that region? How do you see that panning out?
Well, the situation during when Poroshenko was the president until 2019, we had a situation whereby almost every day you would have somebody killed, one or two soldiers or civilians. Most day you would have deaths. What we have now is after Zelensky met with Putin in Paris, signed some kind of a roadmap for at least for establishing truce, like real truce in the conflict zone. We have a situation whereby people still get killed, but it happened maybe one person a month, one person in a few weeks. So the number of casualties has reduced quite drastically. So that's real progress. On top of that, and new crossings were created at the contact line. So people who are stuck in the zone that is effectively occupied by Russia or by pro-Russian separatists, people have a chance of going into Ukraine. And for starters, to pick up the Ukrainian pensions. Many of the people left in that zone are elderly, and they are dependent for the money they can only receive on the territory of Ukraine. So that's also a progress. But this progress has been stalled very significantly by the opposition from the nationalists, which now unfortunately is being led by the former president Poroshenko, who announced his list of what he calls the red lines. And this list is extremely extensive, extremely rigid, and it doesn't leave any room for compromise with the Russians. And it's just a fact of life that and to achieve any progress there, you need to compromise with the Russians because Russians are stronger and the Western support is limited. The West is not going to send their soldiers to fight and die against the Russians. And that's the equation. So it's all hanging in the balance.
Okay, Simon Jackson and then Yuri Vint. So Simon Jackson.
Assuming the election of a comedian is essentially a protest in the spirit of five-star Trump and Brexit, is the joke now wearing a little thin? And if so, what are the alternatives for the future other than a return to the status quo ante?
Leonid.
It wasn't so much a protest vote, I would say. It was a vote of desperation, and it was a recognition of what I believe is a fact, that both pre-Maidan and post-Maidan political elites are extremely corrupt, extremely selfish, and disinterested in advancing, in promoting any progress in Ukraine. So people voted for somebody who represented, first of all, represented normality. Like this person, Zelensky, was normal as opposed to political figures that they were seeing at the helm for years, and political figures who didn't really change after the revolution.
Someone they could trust, but do they still trust him to do the job now?
Zelensky's rating was phenomenal for Ukraine. Ukraine is usually not very fond of its politicians, but Zelensky, when he was elected for a very long period by Ukrainian standards, he maintained an election rating that was comparable to Putin's in Russia. It was quite phenomenal. Then it started dropping to something more normal, and it's now below 50%. It dropped from somebody around 80, so he lost quite significantly in his support. However, if you compare him to other political leaders in Ukraine, Zelensky is still by far the most popular politician, despite, as I said, the lack of real progress on most fronts where people expect and want this progress to happen.
Okay, let's come to Yuri Vint, with a good question about identity, and I think religion feeds into this as well. Go ahead, Yuri.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm just curious. There was a passing reference to religion as being part of and the church being part of the Ukrainian identity, and I didn't understand that. And I was wondering where that factors in to the division in the politics of Ukraine.
All right. Well, the question of the church is always interesting because in all post-Soviet countries, what you have, if you look at the polls, is that in any given country, in Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, some 85% or 90% of people would say that yes, we are religious, we are Christians, and in Russia and most of Ukraine, they would say they are Orthodox Christians. If you look at church attendance, then you will find out that the number of people who actually go into the church is like 2%, 3%. People who go to church once a month or even twice a year for Christmas and Easter, it's very minimal. The function
be far less than in Russia, is that right? There's been a religious revival in Russia, so it's lower than Russia. Is that right, Leonid?
No, it's the same in Russia. Basically, people declare themselves to be Orthodox Christian, but they don't go to church. It's only the babushkas, the old women, just like in the Soviet times, who make the bulk of regular attendance in the church. Ukraine is actually because Ukraine has more village population and more countryside population, more people go to church in Ukraine. And Ukraine and church is somewhat more important in Ukraine than it is in Russia. But
the church split. That's one of the things worth mentioning is that the
But what the church is important is it is important as identify as a national identifier. So it's part of the nationalist ideology and part of the national identity. And in Ukraine, it is especially important because there are several churches, they're competing with each other for the congregations. And the biggest church in Ukraine is affiliated with the Russian church. It reports to the Russian patriarch. So Ukraine has been, the Ukrainian political establishment has been busy trying to unify the other churches and to create an alternative, independent, autonomous Ukrainian church. It was part of President Poroshenko's election campaign against Zelensky. He did succeed in creating a kind of autonomous church, not really autonomous because it reports to the patriarch in Constantinople in Istanbul. Mm-hmm. However, he did achieve it, but it didn't help him to win the election, which shows a lot.
I think language is really the key dividing point, though, isn't it? In terms of how language is treated, its use in official papers, how it can be used in universities. So it's the status of the Russian language and the Ukrainian nationalists really wanting to try and demote that as much as possible.
Well, that's kind of a tragedy in Ukraine, that Western countries, and particularly the United States, historically, they stake on the nationalists in Ukraine, on Western Ukrainians and on the nationalists. And that's linked to the influx of Ukrainian refugees after the World War II. They would be from Western Ukraine, they would be from the anti-Soviet insurgents who fought against the Red Army in the final years of the war. It so happens that these people were also members of crypto-fascist organizations, and they were outright, many of them were outright Nazi collaborators. And this ideology unfortunately permeates the nationalist part of the Ukrainian society, and it alienates a lot of Russian speakers, many of whom would otherwise be much keener to actually embrace, this course of joining the European Union, joining NATO. Mind you, millions of Russian speakers, they did embrace Maidan. Numerous Russian speakers, they are so angry about Russia invading Ukraine, that despite them being Russian speakers, they have now fully adopted the nationalist agenda of the Western Ukrainians. But yet, and the election of Zelensky shows it quite clearly, millions remain alienated, and millions remain outside this European Westernizing project. And that's for no good reason, in my opinion.